what it does to a war, why is it important, and why has it come to be called as the god of war.
At the end of the day, it is all about ordnance on target. How you drop the explosives on your target, whether it's from aircraft or it's from tube artillery. And that's what the Russians are really good at. They've never had a great air force, but they have had world-class artillery.
Vikramjit Singh from the Times of India, who in 2022 wrote a piece about the Kargil war, in which in the intro he says, Bofors was like an enraged bull, goring and stomping upon the entrenched Pakistani army.
Yes, Indians not studying their own wars, a way that other countries would, because we fought the kind of wars again that many people haven't ever fought.
But they are the ones using it. They are the ones who know what that gun is all about. So is it disheartening for them that, most people, when you say Bofors, instantly think corruption?
If you don't have your own systems, if you don't have your own indigenous products, if you can't service them in the country, if you can't build your own supply chains, if you can't provide ammunition for them, you can't fight a war. It's as simple as that.
But what was that X factor? Was it officers like General Shankar, or was it something else? What was the X factor?
They said, let's just go with what the case that has been initiated. We just follow that line, and 5-6 years down the line, we're going to see that case through. And that's exactly what's happened.
Welcome to Inner Defense. This episode comes in the week India prepares to celebrate Vijay Divas on July 26th. This is the 26th anniversary of India's victory in the conflict against Pakistan in Kargil. A limited war rather, a conventional limited war that saw around a month and a half of fighting, around 2 weeks of which was very, very intense fighting. India and its military has taken various lessons from it. In fact, I think it's one of those seminal moments for India's military that's led to a lot of topics that we end up discussing on this podcast, especially when it comes to the reforms of the India's military setup and the equipment that we currently use, modernization of it, Indianization of it, etc. And we're going to do that as well on this episode by focusing on that one key factor that was responsible for turning the tables in Pakistan and ensuring that India won its hard-fought victory, the artillery. And for that, I have with me Sandeep Unnithan. Hey Sandeep, hi, how are you?
Hey, good Dave, good to be back.
Yeah. Sandeep, Kargil war, I think for many people, especially for people like you, is, I think, one of the most studied aspects of India's military, especially because like I was talking about, many things that are happening right now, whether it is theaterization, whether it is a setting up of the Chief of Defence Staff post, whether it is an extra focus on Indian-made, Indian-developed equipment and stuff like that. All of that can be traced back to the Kargil war and the reform sort of it pushed, because before that, India had seen a lot of, you can say, decades of peace, during which you could say the military and the entire setup was sort of lulled into this pacifist mode where they thought that wars would no longer be fought.
Yeah, right.
And then Kargil war came along, and I'm guessing you must have seen it up close.
Absolutely. Dave, unfortunately, I didn't cover the war in the theatre, of course. Gaurav was there. I was in the Indian Express then. I was in Mumbai. Gaurav Sawant, who was my colleague here in Delhi at the Indian Express, he covered the war. But I got a ringside view of Kargil, of course, much later when I moved to Delhi, and one heard stories of the war and the reforms that you mentioned that had been kicked in. So I actually covered the second part of the reforms, and the fact that the Chief of Defence Staff was the biggest reform to have come out of the Kargil war. They did something called the Kargil Review Committee.
And then various other committees, by the way.
Well, there were various other committees, but primarily you have to read that document, Dave. It's a good one. The Kargil Review Committee, I think it's one of the finest works of its kind, and anyone who's interested in knowing about India's defense and the loopholes and how we've kind of fixed it, you got to go out and read that KRC report. It's very exhaustive in the way they approached this. They admitted that there had been certain deficiencies, and they set out to fix it. Right from coastal security to theaterization, indigenization, modernization, all of that things. The Indian system is very interesting, Dave. We don't move unless there's a crisis.
Yes.
It's that classic Indian thing. It's like we only reform after a crisis.
Yes.
Like you have to kick economic liberalization when you have no forex reserves to pay for your imports, right? And so you have to pledge your gold. That's when you start liberalization, opening up the economy. you start defense reforms only after you've been surprised in Kargil. And of course, Kargil was a surprise. It was a rude shock because the system was planning to fight one kind of war and it got pushed into another kind of war. We never thought there would be, an all-out India-Pakistan war, even a limited one of the kind of that we saw in Kargil after the nuclearization of the subcontinent in 1998. And this is again what General Musharraf gambled on. And he was a gambler. He figured that because India and Pakistan now had nuclear weapons, there would be no conflict. So he tried to probe under the nuclear overhang and send these long-range penetration missions to capture the heights of Kargil, thinking that because there was a nuclear overhang in the subcontinent, India would not retaliate conventionally, right? So, of course, that notion of his was shattered when India struck back viciously and vigorously with artillery and fighter jets and, of course, infantry assaults of the kind that perhaps hasn't been seen in the history of conflict. And it is important, to never underestimate your enemy. And that's what Kargil teaches you. Just as Operation Sindoor has taught you that never underestimate your adversary. He might be down and out. His forex reserves might have been exhausted. He's possibly just 1/10 or 1/20th of your size, but he is still burning with some kind of resentment. He wants to settle scores with you, and therefore he will always surprise you, and you have to be extremely wary of that.
Yeah, right. So on this episode, Sandeep, we're going to talk about artillery, and we'll talk about the role it played during the Kargil conflict and what's happened since, especially the development of the ATAGS, the Advanced Towed Artillery Gun System. That system, it's almost like been another radar, so to speak. It's I think been under development for the last 12 years or so. And recently, the government has placed an order for, I think, rupees 7,000 crore worth of these guns with two private sector companies, Tata and Bharat Forge. It's been developed by the DRDO, the DRDO's ARD laboratory.
Yes.
But before we get to Kargil, and then before we talk about what India has been doing in terms of developing its own artillery gun, I want to talk about the concept of artillery in general and what it does to a war. Why is it important, and why has it come to be called as the god of war? I think that quote goes back to Joseph Stalin, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, God of War and the King of Battle, because artillery, ever since artillery appeared on the battlefield, it kind of completely changed the equation, because gone were the ability of forces to mass in the ways that you couldn't have masses of tanks. If your adversary had big artillery and sizable artillery, you could not mass your forces. You couldn't launch armored assaults. You couldn't launch any kind of assault, because an artillery barrage is the most destructive kind of warfare. And I just hope many people aren't at the receiving end of an artillery barrage. I haven't been at one, but I have seen these guns fire, and I know the kind of destructive potential that they can do, where they can literally obliterate targets 30 or 40 kilometers away, the size of 10 football fields. A battery of guns, that's about 8 guns, can knock out an area the size of 10 football fields 30 kilometers away in all weather conditions, day or night, and you can't do anything about it. The shell will land irrespective, despite the fact that it could be rain, shine, day, night. A shell is a shell, and it's the cheapest and the most inexpensive way of landing what they call ordnance on target. You can't intercept it. It just comes in at supersonic speed and it just drops onto target. And all of this stuff that's being made about drone warfare, and that's the big thing, and it's going to replace everything. I actually disagree, because I'm waiting for the day when drones can actually take 10 kgs of ordnance in all weather conditions, in all jamming environments, in all day, night and all that, and drop it on target, right? They've not got that sophisticated yet. We still have a couple of years before that happens. But until then, it is artillery which is the god of war, the king of battle. And one of the most precious things in the world today is the 155 artillery shell. Everybody is now restarting their production lines, because everybody got lulled into this false sense of complacency. We are not going to fight wars of attrition. And here you have, lo and behold, the Russian Federation enters the war. And for all those people who looked at the Russians, the way they fought the war in Ukraine, they said, oh, they have such a shot up air force. They don't have an air force worth the thing. They're going to, they're going to collapse. They're not able to fight. Little realizing that, at the end of the day, it is all about ordnance on target. How you drop the explosives on your target, whether it's from aircraft or it's from tube artillery. And that's where the Russians are really good at. They've never had a great air force, but they have had world-class artillery. They've literally pioneered so many concepts of artillery, whether it is mass artillery gun firing or rockets. They've pioneered so many artillery advancements in the Second World War, for instance. And they are master strategists when it comes to artillery. And that's what they used in the Ukraine war as well, at least in the initial phases. So a lot of the advances, a lot of the victories that the Russians fought were through their tube artillery, rockets and artillery shells. And now the world is now waking up that, look, if you're going to fight a war of attrition, you need to have artillery, you need to have shells, you need to have howitzers, guns of all kinds, shapes and sizes. And that's where the world is really going towards. So drones can at best be a stopgap for countries which don't have artillery. It gives you an inexpensive way of launching ordnance, which of course can be intercepted, but artillery can't be. So if a country has huge ammunition reserves, it has a large number of guns, thousands of guns, it's an artillery power, then the other side will actually think twice before attacking them and all that. So it's not curtains for artillery yet. There's a lot of fight in this beast.
Yeah, which is, I'm guessing, exactly why India chose to develop the ATAGS and is so sort of upbeat on its successful development and now sort of very close induction. Going back to the Kargil war now and talking about the artillery used and the much maligned Bofors gun.
Yeah.
I say much maligned because, for the longest time while I was growing up, Bofors for me and for lots of people from my generation meant one single thing: corruption.
Corruption, yeah.
That's the thing Bofors
tragedy.
made headlines for. Yeah, that's
tragedy.
the thing Bofors
It was a
made
good
headlines
gun.
for.
I mean, it still is a good gun. It's an excellent gun.
Which is what I realized actually when I started reading up more about defense and when I started reading up about especially the Kargil war.
Yes.
And how the Bofors was that turning point, that X factor basically. So much so that, in fact, a fun nugget that it's widely reported that India had to go for an emergency procurement of ammunition, and for that they had to sidestep a ban that had been imposed on AB Bofors because of that corruption scandal.
Yes.
So the government of India had banned any dealings with that company,
Yeah.
but the army was like, bro, this is the gun that's going to win us the battle. We need the bullet, the ammunition for it.
We need the ammunition, we need the parts and all of that.
So tell us about Kargil, the use of Bofors artillery. There's this nice quote from a reporter, Vikramjit Singh from the Times of India, who in 2022 wrote a piece about the Kargil war, in which in the intro he says, Bofors was like an enraged bull, goring and stomping upon the entrenched Pakistani army soldier. Very vivid picture is what it paints. So Sandeep, tell us about Bofors, tell us about artillery, and why do we regard it as that X factor that turned Kargil war in Africa?
Well, the X factor is spot on, Dave. A little secret about the Kargil war. I mean, it's not a secret anymore. We give it to the Pakistanis, who actually came out with their statistics in the Kargil war about in 2010 or so, where we discovered, after studying the statistics, that literally 60 to 70% of the Pakistani casualties had been caused by Indian artillery.
Wow.
Right. So that clearly tells you who did the bulk of the, wounding the enemy and, maiming his forces. It was Indian artillery and all kinds, whether it was direct hits on target, it was airbursts, it was hitting the ammunition dumps in the rear. A lot of soldiers died because of Indian artillery. This is, of course, not taking away from the absolutely spectacular bravery that our infantry soldiers did, climbing literally. No army in the world would have done the kind of, heroic deeds that the Indian army did in Op Vijay. Let's face it, literally climbing near vertical cliffs to capture the enemy posts, recapture those posts, hand-to-hand combat with the enemy. This at such altitudes, 15,000, 18,000 feet. It's like fighting on the surface of the moon or something. No army in the world has fought this kind of a war, incidentally. And that's what Kargil was. But the secret of that, which was realized much later, was the fact that the shelling that India, launched in Kargil, something like 200,000 rounds were fired, right? Artillery, tube artillery, rockets, everything. That's a lot of ordnance that fell on the Pakistanis. And, an artillery barrage, like I was saying, it's the most terrifying thing ever. You hear the screech of the thunder of the artillery, the screech of the shells, and then finally the earth shakes, and it is a terrible thing to be at the receiving end of that. So while Pakistan may have had this brilliant tactical move of capturing the winter vacated posts of the Indian Army, you can just imagine what it must have been for those guys at the receiving end, the Northern Light Infantry, literally being battered day and night by Indian artillery and air-to-ground munitions before the Indian soldiers, appeared with assault rifles and bayonets in their hands. It would have been a terrifying thing, and that just tells you how callous this artillery officer across the border was. General Musharraf.
Yes.
Artillery officer turned commando. And he, incidentally, this is something I picked up from his autobiography, In the Line of Fire, what else? Where Musharraf says that he actually planned Kargil because he figured that India did not have enough artillery to, strike back at Pakistan. They would have to denude their artillery. They would have to move artillery up from the plains towards the mountains if they were to strike back at Pakistan. And in a manner of speaking, he was correct. Because we had to move all our guns, all our available artillery up, focus it, concentrate fire, and you had, towards the end of Op Vijay, we had something like 100 guns firing on a single target.
Yes.
And that's how good we had got it. There were literally army officers who were using the Bofors guns, the much-maligned Bofors guns, like rifles. They were literally pointing it at a target and they were saying bang,
Sniper rifle.
Yeah, like using it like a gigantic sniper rifle, firing these 10 kg, shells straight into bunkers and, mountain tops. Literally cliffs were disintegrating, they were just altering the features of the cliffs and the mountain tops in Kargil using artillery.
Yeah, in fact, you're right. So there's this piece by Lieutenant General P.R. Shankar, who's the former DG of artillery for the Indian Army.
Artillery evangelist, that's what I call him.
And in that piece, he talks about how a lot of the piece. This is from 2024, is about this direct firing that was done by the Indian Army. And in a previous season, Shiv Arur, who was there as the guest, he spoke about this. I don't want to use the word jugaad because you don't like it. So I'll say modification that Indian engineers carried out to the Bofors gun that even the Swedish had not thought of. To be able to use this gun, like you said, in sort of direct firing, like almost like a sniper rifle. Can you tell us a bit more about that? So what was this thing that we Indians did that even the Swedish had not thought of with their own guns?
Right. Well, it was just that I guess the Swedes hadn't employed this gun. See, the FH-77B is a Swedish gun, but it was the use of it in combat was basically an Indian innovation. The Swedes had never used it in the kind of conditions and in combat the way the Indian Army had done. Right. So in Kargil, when you're there when you're deployed with the gun for several weeks and months, you develop a certain sense of, comfort with your hardware. That's when you can innovate, you can improvise, and then you can, use it exactly in the way that you want to. And it's not only the FH-77B, it's also the K9 Vajra.
Yes.
Very interesting, which has been deployed there. This is public knowledge, it's not secret stuff, but it's been there in Ladakh from 2020, ever since the Chinese moved in. And the Indian Army discovered that this gun had been acquired from South Korea for use in the plains and the deserts as on a tracked vehicle. But it performed fabulously well in high altitudes because it had actually been designed for use in the high altitudes of South Korea with North Korea, against North Korea. So that was a pure South Korean gun. This was a pure Swedish gun. But when it came into Indian hands, you have the user who's very experienced on a whole variety of guns, then starts to use it for exactly the kind of use that he sees for it. I don't think the Swedish designers ever thought that it would be used in the kind of role that it was used in Kargil, right? What was the FH-77B designed for? It was meant to be a towed artillery gun, which would be towed into combat by a tractor, which is a large 4x4 or 6x6 vehicle. It would accompany artillery. It would accompany the infantry and the military thrust on the plains. It could also be used in the mountains. But this particular aspect of being positional mountain warfare, literally being used against mountain tops and sangars and, shooting out individual bunkers and altering features and all that. This is something that I don't think even the original designers would have envisaged. So this is the modification that came about when the gunners started using it, and they discovered that they could fire it in direct fire mode. It could be a very devastating weapon in direct fire. So that's how this particular innovation came out. And that's why the Bofors gun, the gunners, all our artillery regiment guys, they love the gun so much, and it continues in service in various other forms. The Dhanush, for instance, the indigenous gun, it is a reverse engineered FH-77B.
Right. Another point on the use of Bofors and artillery in the Kargil war, and again, it's quite unconventional, is what, again, the general writes in his piece, is that one, it was deployed very close to the actual fighting, which is not normally what you expect with artillery, because it's devastating, like you said. So to ensure safety
at ranges,
at ranges. But it was deployed quite close, and that multiple guns were used to target one single target. In fact, he calls it almost like cracking a nut with a sledgehammer. Targeting a very small area with multiple barrages of basically artillery fire. And also the fact that you had artillery officers embedded with infantry platoons that were actually climbing those mountains. In fact, you had, I think, a couple of officers and one gunner who was awarded the Veer Chakra because of the sacrifices that they made during the battles. So I want to talk about this. I want you to tell us about this as well. So what was this deployment? This very close quarter deployment, and in fact, I've heard stories where infantry officers called fire upon themselves because they were sort of stuck, and they were like, just fire in the general area of where we are. We'll take cover and we'll just hope that this barrage sort of takes out the Pakistanis.
Right, absolutely. It's one of the most dangerous things. Again, like see, again, this gun was designed for use on the plains, possibly in the deserts and all, not in this kind of environment. I mean, Kargil, again, the kind of war that's never been fought, possibly in the history of conflict, where you have the adversary perched on multiple fort-like structures, these sangars, heavily defended. These are stone fortresses. Many of them are interlinked on ridge lines, features. You have trenches. They have fire support as well. So they're not sitting there, by themselves. They have fire support, which is mortars, rockets, their own medium artillery in the rear. So they can call on fire support as well. And they're, faced with Indian artillery in front of them. And of course, the infantry, which has to actually physically climb and recapture posts. It's a very, very complex kind of thing. So if you're looking at the conventional kind of battlefield that's on the plains where, the artillery stops firing after the infantry is in contact with the enemy because you don't want to end up killing on your own troops, right? They stop firing. It's after the initial barrage, the guns stop firing, and then the infantry moves in, the armor moves in and all that, right? So it starts with an artillery barrage. But here you had the problem that the terrain is completely different, right? It is literally vertical. And if you have soldiers that are climbing over there, they are literally in contact with the enemy. There have been such instances. I remember this was Brigadier Karyappa's unit. I think he was the 5-para officer who just recently retired. He called fire upon himself because they were in such close contact with the enemy that this was a risk that they were prepared to take. It's extremely risky, calling fire upon yourself when you're literally in contact with the enemy. You could be killed by that. But I think they decided that it was, it was well worth the risk to capture those features that they had to. So this is, again, we've not studied this war enough in a way that maybe other countries would have. Again, it comes back down to this thing of Indians not studying their own wars, a way that other countries would. Because we fought the kind of wars, again, that many people haven't ever fought, whether it's 1971, the diverse terrain that it was fought on, or in Kargil, this very unique, battle space, mountains with sangars, troops embedded over there, your infantry climbing, uh, artillery duels across the LAC, those kind of things, very, very unusual conditions. So if you have your own artillery, you have your own supply chain, you have your own ammunition, then you're in a much better position. And I think that was one of the biggest lessons that the Indian Army learned after Kargil. And I think it's DGs like General Shankar and his colleagues who actually did a lot of things in the last 25 years to actually make us Atmanirbhar in artillery. And today we are where we are, 26 years later. This is one of the most astounding successes of Atmanirbharta, if you can call it, indigenization. And it has been Indian artillery. It is outstanding the way we've been able to indigenize not just the guns, gun making, every aspect of gun making, from forging, casting, making barrels, to building ammunition of all kinds, weapon locating radars, command and control systems, the Shakti command and control system that's used to direct artillery fire, to the gun tractors, the trucks, everything, fuses, everything. Something like 80 to 90% of our artillery requirements are indigenous. Yeah. I spoke to a friend of mine who was in one of the commands recently, and he said, they had an exercise a couple of months back, and he said, for me, the biggest learning was that after so many years, it was the ammunition. He says that something like 90% of the ammunition that we used for this exercise was all made in India. And this was a huge change over the last 2 decades, right? Earlier, you would always depend that, I've run out of ammunition, now I need to buy it from here or there. I have to import ammunition, I have to import fuses. But today, he says the biggest change has been the fact that close to 90% of our artillery is made in India. And it's except for very specialized, platforms like, helicopter gunships and all that, which need certain specialized ammunition. The rest of it is all made in India. The bulk of the 155 guns, for instance, the fuses and the charges and all made in India.
So 250,000 shells is what the general says were fired during the war in a period of around 10 to 15 days. Is what it
it's
says.
250,000. It's a lot of shells.
A lot of shells, and I think around 9,000 of them just on the famous Tiger Hill.
Yes.
I think which a lot of people connect with. Yeah. Right. We'll move to now about what India has done since, what you kind of briefly referred to, but we'll go into a bit of detail there and also talk about the ATAGS separately.
Yeah.
But just before that, one quick point on the Bofors. So, like I said, much maligned. When you talk to people in the army, when you talk to people in the artillery, whether they are retired, whether they served during Kargil or whether they are in service right now, how do they see that episode? They see that part of because the thing is military officers by their very nature will not comment on something that's political, that's controversial.
Yeah.
But they are the ones using it. They are the ones who know what that gun is all about. So is it disheartening for them that, most people, when you say Bofors, instantly think corruption and like, corruption, but don't really know about the value of the gun?
Yeah, well, it's really important, Dave. You have to first talk about what the Bofors scandal was really. You know? It's and why it would frighten one political party the way it did. Now, Rajiv Gandhi comes to power in 1984 in the biggest mandate ever seen in independent India's history, right? 400 plus seats. 414, I think.
Yes.
404, which became 414. More than 400 seats. No political party has ever got 400 seats. Now, that was 1984. 1987, you have the Bofors scandal, which breaks out, which is India has bought in 1986 410 Bofors guns from Sweden, AB Bofors of Sweden. And in 1987, Swedish radio reports that kickbacks were paid, bribes were paid in this deal, despite the fact that there was an explicit understanding between the two countries that no bribes would be, no kickbacks would be paid. Now, we had a very brave journalist there, Chitra Subramaniam, who exposed this. She was writing for The Hindu and later the Indian Express, where she exposed the fact that bribes were indeed paid. And she did the kind of investigations that no journalist in India has ever done in independent India's history, where they actually established money trails, money going from Bofors to certain agents who were close to the government of India, which established that money had been paid. The opposition picked it up. There was a big scandal. There were all kinds of slogans that were made around this corruption scandal of the Bofors thing. And 5 years later, that's 1989, you had the Congress party voted out of power, right? From 400 seats, it came to less than 300 seats. It was 200 plus seats, but it had to sit in the opposition. So the Congress has never got an electoral majority since 1984, right? So that psyched them. The fact that one corruption scandal, which was true, by the way, there was money paid. We still don't know who received the money. There is a lot of speculation. If you ask Chitra Subramaniam, she will tell you, not in as many words, who got the money. Money was paid, but the fact is it was a very good gun. And this is what worries the Indian Army, the Indian armed forces, that you take political calls. The Indian Army selects a weapon, or the Navy selects a particular platform, the government imports it, bribes are paid, and then the government gets paralysis when it comes to ordering more, or doing a transfer of technology or some agreement with that. And we said, oh, no, we are not going to deal with these guys. Little realizing that the market for these specialized systems is very limited.
Yeah.
It's just a few companies, 2 or 3. If you start blacklisting companies like we did post the Bofors deal and the HDW submarine deal, the other guys are going to charge you a premium, right? And there's only one antidote to this, which is what we've now injected ourselves. That antidote is indigenization,
Yes.
which was never thought of in the 80s. Because, even when we went into Kargil in 1999, we went in with imported guns. The 130 it's an imported Soviet howitzer. The 155 it's an imported Bofors gun. You're at the mercy of foreign suppliers. You're at the mercy of Bofors. You're at the mercy of the Russians. You're at the mercy of the Israelis. You're at the mercy of the South Africans. I mean, what a terrible situation to be. You can't fight your own wars. You don't have your own equipment. And I think that was a big wake-up call that a lot of the officers got, especially the artillery corps, like General Shankar, that look, we need to have our own guns. We need to build our own howitzers. And how they maneuvered around the political reluctance to do business with Bofors. There was a lot of competitions where Bofors would again emerge the L1, and the only bidder, and the government said, oh, no, anyone but Bofors. We can't do business with them. And, so then the artillery said, okay, fine. There are those blueprints that we bought from Bofors. We paid top dollar for those blueprints. They're still lying in the ordnance factory board.
Wow.
Why don't we take it out and start building guns of our own? So the deal in 86 was that it was for a total of 1,400 guns, right? Or 1,500 guns, if I remember correctly. Yeah. 410 would be bought off the shelf from Bofors. The remainder 1,100 guns would be built in India through transfer of technology. We bought the 410 guns and we forgot about the TOT part. The technology had already been transferred. The blueprints were already with us. We didn't do anything about it. So the army said, let's find those blueprints. Let's start making the guns. So in 2010, which is 15 years ago, you saw projects like the Dhanush, taking shape, where ordnance factory reached in. They started building the old Bofors gun, rebuilding, guns based on the Bofors. That's how you have the Dhanush coming out. And, this is again, it reinforces the point that if you don't have your own systems, if you don't have your own indigenous products, if you can't service them in the country, if you can't build your own supply chains, if you can't provide ammunition for them, you can't fight a war. It's as simple as that. Then the only kind of war you'll be able to fight is going to be decided by how much of stocking you've done of either the parts, the components, or the ammunition. Imported weapons, that is. Then you will have foreign countries saying, oh, we have supply chain issues. We can't supply you jet engines. We can't supply you helicopter gunships. Where have you heard that before? Yeah.
Finally, 3 have come, though. The helicopter gunships.
Well, thank you. Thank you for those 15 months later. Yeah. It's almost like we got them for free, and it's like, we can't give you.
Though the Apaches, I think, are a topic for another episode, because I have lots of questions there, especially questions like, why does both the Army and the Air Force have them? But again, let's save them for a different episode. Right. We'll talk more about what you were just describing right now, but after a quick break.
My blood sugar was 210. I'm very happy to admit it. But that's when I started to look up the nutritional content. So I went to the website, and over there they have the ingredients mentioned. That khichdi had hydrogenated vegetable oil, or basically dalda, and ghee essence, which is something I have never heard about. So, these sort of tricks just, it really reduces your faith in what's in the market.
If you talk about FMCG, if you talk about F&B, all these industries,
I wonder if they hire a designer just to hide the content somewhere.
would be. One thing is that yes, they're hiding it out. The second thing is that now you have discovered after going on their website, it is very important for anybody to read the label. At this point of time, if you ask me, there are very selective brands in India which serve keto compliant food or which serve food which is diabetic compliant, and most of them also have ingredients which are very, very, you can say, questionable.
Welcome back. Sandeep, before the break, you kind of spoke about what I wanted to ask you actually, is what have we done since the Kargil war in terms of artillery? So I'll skip that question and instead ask you to describe how we've done it. Because on this podcast, on previous seasons as well as on this season with you, top focus has been how at many times we've tried to develop things on our own but have not been able to for various reasons. There are some projects that stand out. One of them was BrahMos, though not technically fully Indian, but still it's one of those one of the projects you can be proud of when it comes to how you've gone about developing it, building it, etc. Nuclear subs is something else that comes to my mind. This actually is also one of the success stories. And it's very surprising because I honestly did not know much about it. It's only when I started researching deeply for this episode when I was a bit taken up. I was like, whoa, we've done some good stuff over here. So tell us, how did we end up on this journey? What went right when it comes to, making your own artillery guns? And why have we not really seen a lot of conversation on this?
Right. Well, I think it's been one of those slow burners, right? It's happened over a period of time. Capacities can't be created overnight. And the story of Indian artillery is actually something that's unfolded over a quarter of a century, 25 years, right? So when you're talking of the realization in Kargil that, look, artillery is really important because it saved the day for us. If we didn't have the kind of artillery we did, we wouldn't have been able to inflict the kind of damage that we did back then. Just the way Op Sindoor would have been very different if we didn't have the BrahMos missiles, right? We've discussed that in the past. But what happened is that in the 90s, the Indian Army realized that they needed to upgrade their artillery. We had all kinds of artillery, 105 and 130. This new 155 was coming in. So they decided to go in for the mediumization of artillery.
Why am I not surprised, by the way?
Which is that, to go for a larger number of regiments with 155 mm. Standardized on the 155 mm. So they projected a requirement of something like 2,800 guns, which they wanted to acquire over progressively by the 2020s, right? That's also running late, by the way. We are in 2025, we're still not there yet. The new deadline is 2035, which is another decade. But the idea was to go in for a huge mediumization of the Indian artillery, and they projected the requirement for 5 different types of guns. Right. So the first one, of course, is going to be the towed guns, like the FH-77 Bofors, which means that the gun has to be literally towed by another vehicle. The other one was a tracked howitzer, which is a tank with a howitzer on it, which is the K9 Vajra. The ultralight howitzer, which is a very light howitzer that can be literally picked up by a helicopter and carried into battles. It weighs just about less than 10 tons. So it can be carried underslung by a Chinook. Then the mounted gun system, which is basically a 6x6 vehicle and with a 155 mm gun on it. And then, of course, the wheeled, this would have a mounted gun would be on a truck, and you would have a wheeled APC with a gun. So the last one has now been deleted. I don't think they want wheeled APCs with 155 mm guns. They've gone in for all of these other acquisitions. Now, I remember writing this story for India Today magazine about 15 years back, where I was looking at all the categories, these 5 categories that we had drawn up. And believe it or not, every single one of those categories was an import, right? And I could see the foreign arms firms literally salivating at the prospect of this $20 billion or so worth of guns that we were planning to buy over 20 years. Right? It was all imports. It was all foreign companies. It was South African companies. It was, of course, Swedish companies, British companies, all of those. So now, 15 years after that story, from 2010, I'm looking at 2025, we have imported a few ultralight howitzers from the Americans, the ULH 155-39 ultralight howitzers, the K9 Vajra, but that's a different story. That's actually, L&T has converted that into a...
From South Korea.
Yeah, from South Korea, but they've made it into a very, it's like 60% indigenous, 50 to 60% indigenous. A lot of it is made in country, so that's a different kind of thing. But the rest of the categories, the towed guns, for instance, all Indian companies are there. You have so many Indian companies there. You have Bharat Forge, which is several categories of howitzers. You have the erstwhile Ordnance Factory Board that's making them, like the Dhanush, for instance. You have the ATAGS, which is made by Tatas and by Bharat Forge, another towed gun system. And then the most interesting contest now is for the mounted gun system, where again you have a lot of Indian companies in the fray. So, 26 years after Kargil today, it's a bonanza for indigenous howitzer manufacturers. Like, you have literally end-to-end capacities to build howitzers, not just towed or tracked, but mounted gun systems, ultralight howitzers even. So you have Indian companies that have really stepped up. They've made investments. The most outstanding example of that was Mr. Baba Kalyani of Bharat Forge. He went out there 20 years back to a Swiss company called Ruag that was going bust, and he bought their entire gun line and he, shipped it to Pune, lock, stock and barrel, because he believed that, you needed to make your own guns. And this is something that if you look at it in history also, the battles in India have been decided by artillery. It's not just Kargil, right? Right from the Battle of Panipat that Babur fought in the 16th century, Ibrahim Lodi's army was scattered because Babur used the first cannons in conflict, right? Of course, Babur's army was better organized. They were, much more maneuverable. They had cavalry, but they are also artillery, which was a game changer in that sense. So every time artillery is being used in Indian context, the armies have literally collapsed and fled. And I think this was a lesson that later Indian rulers also learned. The Sikh Empire, they had very good artillery. The Maratha Empire, of course, they had very good artillery as well. But of course, they were bested by the British, who also invested in good artillery, cavalry, used native infantry and all. But that's a long story. The short story is that unless you have your own artillery, indigenous artillery, you don't master your own artillery, right from your metallurgy to ammunition production, fuse manufacturing and command and control system, you're going to be bested by your adversary. And I think that lesson has been learnt. And you have so many companies today in the fray. And, one of the most amazing things that I saw is when I visited the Bharat Forge plant a couple of months back, last year, I saw this row of 4x4 heavy armored vehicles with 155mm guns, all for Armenia. Yeah, ready off the production line in Armenian colors, and they were being shipped over there. So that's where we are today. We are not just making artillery for our Indian armed forces, but we are exporting them as well.
Yeah, right. So, Sandeep, if we say that Bofors was the X factor in the Kargil war, helping India win the conflict, what would you say was the X factor in ensuring that the story that you just told us turned out the way it did? Because what you've described is something we've discussed previously in terms of, like, theoretically speaking, this is the textbook example of how you go about developing a piece of defense equipment when you want to do it on your own. This is a good example. All the private sector, have your government labs to sort of design it, get the customer, the army in this case, on board with the designing, with the testing in terms of the requirements, etc. Ask the customer to be practical about the requirements that they have. So, okay, good to know that everything turned out so well. But what was that X factor? Was it officers like General Shankar, or was it something else? What was the X factor?
No, you're absolutely right. Dave, good question. And actually, the X factor there was were the officers, the artillery regiment officers, including General Shankar, General Anjan, all of these officers who were DGs and who were all in the artillery directorates, procurements. They actually put their heads together and said that we must push for these cases, irrespective of who becomes DG. We should ensure that a case, our acquisition cycles, 7 years, 10 years, 15 years, I mean, they go on forever. Longer than the tenure of a DG, a Director General of Artillery. So I think what the DGs did was that they ensured that cases that were handed to them by their predecessors were pushed through irrespective. They never got these big inspirations for, should I say it, multi-caliber artillery or stuff like that. They said, let's just go with what the case that has been initiated. We just follow that line, and 5-6 years down the line, we're going to see that case through. And that's exactly what's happened. And this has been the case from the 2010s until 2025 now. You see, we're very good on artillery. If you do a quick assessment of all the arms of the army, whether it's the infantry, the armored corps, or the army air defense, or the artillery, you will see the artillery is possibly the best resourced of all, because they have followed that one line that was set, and they've gone, after the procurements, and they've ensured that they've got it. And when they absorb that technology, they've ordered more of them. So the Pinaka, for instance, outstanding success. Indigenous, the entire system is indigenous, right? It's one of the very few platforms, systems that you can, sell to a second country without taking permissions from a third country. Entirely Indian. So this kind of understanding was very important in the Directorate of Artillery.
Yeah, right. That's a very good point, actually. And because I think it's very, a lot of people don't realize, and it's very difficult to also wrap your heads around the fact that when it comes to things like these, they take decades. Whether it's submarines, whether it's fighter jets, whether it's, guns, helicopters, gunships, they take decades. So, and tenures of chiefs, whether they are of the services or whether they are of departments within those services, they are like 3, 4, 5 years max.
True.
Right.
And this is I have my dear friend Colonel Anurag Avasthi, who keeps telling me this. He's an ex-Armored Corps officer, and he keeps saying that, the key to all of this is good staff work.
Yes.
And that is where it really matters, because officers who are sitting and making those cases have to put all these factors into mind, do, research, ensure that, exactly like you say, because these cases have huge ramifications down the line. You go for something as bizarre as a multi-caliber rifle, no army in the world has it. It's just going to get thrown out. Either you won't find developers, or it will be unviable for you to buy that system. So go with the tried and tested, with of course some technology element. So staff work is really important in such cases, and that's where I think the Regiment of Artillery has been very well served in these respects.
I mean, because it's a domino effect, right? Because we can sit here and make fun of the Air Force for having all these different fighter jets from different countries, but you have to realize that you can't. The current Air Force chief, for example, is really in a bad spot, because that's happened over years of lack of coordination, let's say. So with stuff like this, I think it's also very important.
He's 2 squadrons down as we speak.
It's very important for the team to sort of get together, because it's not about what I'm doing in my tenure. It's also about what my juniors are thinking about that, and are they on board, because tomorrow they are the ones who are going to be taking that forward, right? Sandeep, I want to talk about the ATAGS very briefly now, because they are in news. The system is in news. Advanced Towed Artillery Gun System. Like we said, a 7,000 crore order has been placed. Tata Advanced Systems Limited and Bharat Forge will be manufacturing this gun. It has been developed by the DRDO. It's a 12-year project. Tell us a bit about this gun, specifically this particular gun. What is it? What is it? What do you think of it? Think of it in terms of the kind of artillery that we have. Is it the best that we're going to get? And one nugget and a slight tangent is one of the things that's been attributed to it is shoot and scoot.
Yeah.
Now, Sandeep, an artillery gun does not look like something that can scoot to me. So when you use it in the context of an artillery gun, what does that mean exactly?
Well, shoot and scoot is something that was popularized by the FH-77 Bofors when it came. It was one of its USPs where they said that, look, Pakistan had started acquiring counter-battery radars, ANTPQ-37s, if I remember correctly, from the US. So it's counter batteries is basically a radar that analyzes the trajectory of a shell, and which tells you with very great accuracy where that originated from, the exact position that particular round was fired from, and which means that you could fire.
Right.
Counter battery fire, destroying the gun that fired that thing. So now the idea of shoot and scoot was that the gun, after having fired a salvo of artillery rounds, would then immediately change its position. It had an APU on board, an auxiliary power unit, which could move it to a certain distance away from this incoming counter battery fire. So that was the main objective of making these towed guns. While the gun itself is towed, there would be, because of this APU, it would have a certain movement. It could move around, and I've seen that the ATAGS is beautiful in that sense, that it's like a little van. You can actually drive the thing, and it can move around. It can lay a position, as opposed to the conventional towed artillery like the Soviet supplied 130 with very good field artillery thing, but it's a dumb thing. It's just you have to lay it manually, and you have to then align it and fire it. But this is a gun which is a bit, it's like an armored vehicle of sorts. It kind of spins on a dime. It moves around. It can move away sideways like a crab. It's got this very interesting movement. So that's the FH-77B technology, which they kind of brought into the ATAGS as well, the Advanced Towed Array gun system, which the DRDO designed. Incidentally, I think they began designing it in 2007, and they had their first firing prototypes in the 2014, 15 or 16 or something like that. So it went from the drawing board to the firing line in a matter of years. I think it was just about 5-6 years. So the joke about the ATAGS is that it's actually spent more time in the bureaucracy for getting that order, which you just mentioned, than in the actual research and development and trials phase. Because the army had some reservations with the gun about the weight of the gun. It was something like 20 tons. They said, look, it's too heavy to be towed. With the gun tractor, it would be more than 25 tons. Bridges can't take that kind of weight and all that in the forward areas. It's unwieldy. So a lot of those reasons came up in this ATAGS acquisition. And now the army has decided to buy a couple of hundred of those ATAGS guns, but that is not going to be the future towed artillery. Now that they're looking at a gun which is around 15 tons or so, which is a lighter towed artillery, which they will buy in the thousands. The ATAGS will be bought in the hundreds, but the future towed array, the towed gun system will be bought in the thousands. So that is the final piece of the jigsaw that remains to be fulfilled.
Yeah, right. Final point then, and a quick one. So then, is that it? Have you reached the end of artillery development? Because I know, to someone like me, this technology seems to have saturated. I mean, that's it, right? Like, it's basically a gun that fires a round either in a parabolic route or in, like we did with our modifications, in a direct fire. What more can you do with it? So is that it, or are there innovations happening in this field?
Okay, that's a good question there. Now, I think the consensus among developers is that artillery has reached physical limits when it comes to the barrel and the chamber and all of that. And now what you need to do is to have ammunition stepping up and taking over, where the ammunition itself becomes something like a guided projectile. Now, you're already seeing some of that, like the Excalibur round that was used in Op Sindoor. Some of those terrorist launch pads were neutralized using Excalibur rounds fired from the M777. The Excalibur is a smart ammunition round, It's a 155 shell, but it's got GPS, inertial navigation, which brings it bang onto the target. So it's like a smart missile, but it's fired from an artillery tube. So you're going to be looking at changes in the shell itself. You're going to be looking at hypersonic projectiles being fired out of conventional artillery, guns, and this is where ramjet propelled rounds are going to be interesting. So I've seen some of those conceptual, pieces. The DRDO is working on it. General Ravi Shankar, incidentally, is working on it with the IIT Madras, and they promise some breakthroughs on it. It's under testing. It's in the testing phase. It's very hush right now. It's going to come out in a year or two. But what it looks like, the shell, I've seen it. It looks like a mini BrahMos missile. Right? The BrahMos also is a ramjet missile, right? So here they've made the shell itself into a missile of sorts, which is an air-breathing round, and which is able to go at very high speeds to very long ranges. So if you're looking at an ATAGS which can fire a shell to about 40 kilometers plus 45 kilometers, ramjet rounds could go to over 100 kilometers, right? So while your guns and the barrels and the breeches have reached the limit of their development, it's the shells that are now going to take the charge. And the same 155 artillery round, gun is going to be able to fire shells of very, very long ranges, over 150 and 200 kilometers even. So now all the advancements, all the research, all the technology is going into those shells. So you have the 155 the humble 155 shell, 10, 15 years from now is going to look very different from what it is today.
Right. Very interesting. Great then. Thanks, Sandeep. Fantastic chat as always. Great insights. Loved this conversation.
Thank you.
And thanks to our listeners and viewers. That's it for this week's Defense News. For more, tune in next week. Till then, stay safe and do not cross any boundaries with your passport. Bye-bye.